Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to you all. It's my great pleasure to warmly welcome all of you to the webinar, wherever you are joining us from today. I'm Ben Reimer, and on behalf of the Aga Khan University, I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest, our third webinar in the Connecting AKU series. This series is very much intended for and focused on our wider AKU family, including our very generous supporters, former staff, volunteers, and especially our highly beloved alumni. You're all very welcome, and it's great to see such strong interest in the topic today. Since we are physically distanced from one another, what we hope is that through this series, we can keep you all in touch with the incredible work that AKU continues to do, including our response to the COVID-19 crisis and other areas which carry on as well. Today, it's a huge pleasure to have with us two extremely highly qualified discussants to talk about the topic. We have Professor Stephen Lyon, who's Head of Educational Programs at AKU ISMC. We also have Sahibzada Habib ur Rahman, who's a current graduate student on ISMC's MA in Muslim cultures. And they're going to look at the role of social institutions in the coronavirus pandemic in Pakistan, a topic that I'm sure you will agree with me could not be more important and certainly could not be more timely. So the session today will last for 60 minutes. Steve and Habib will speak for 25 to 30 minutes. There will be time after they've finished their discussion for questions. Please do submit these. It's very simple to submit a question. Please email them to us to alumni@aku.edu. I'll say that once more. It's alumni@aku.edu. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over now to Steve and Habib. Steve and Habib, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Habib, are we here? Yes, there he is.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben.
This is a great pleasure to be here. I am not actually on the 9th floor of the Aga Khan Center in London, but I thought my wall is boring. So instead, I would give you a glimpse of what hopefully you will all have already seen. If you haven't already been to London to take a tour of the Aga Khan Center, please do. And on the 9th floor, this is one of the gardens that you will get to see. I asked Habib to come join me on this because when Fatima asked me to come talk about something to do with the anthropology of how societies deal with crises, it occurred to me, of course, I know a lot about kinship and family, but I had a student here, a future alum, who is himself the leader of a spiritual community in Pakistan, and he would be able to speak directly to the role that religious organizations, religious institutions play in responding to crises. Now, we'll be absolutely upfront. That's not always good, right? Religious institutions and family, they're great, but they don't always give us the best response. Sometimes there can be a counterproductive effort on the part of family and kinship. So we're gonna try and talk about the full breadth of how social organization can deal with some of these crises. We've titled it Family, Faith, and Crises, the Role of Social Institutions in the Coronavirus Pandemic. But we really want to go a little bit beyond just this coronavirus pandemic. So what I'm going to do is talk very briefly about some fundamental issues in social organization, the kinds of things that hold societies together, the kinds of things that hold people together. What is the social glue that doesn't require a bureaucracy or a state or an administration or taxation system to function? Those things that just keep human organization, human societies bubbling along, whether people want to be part of a society or not. What is it that keeps us held together? And I think within anthropology, we spend an awful lot of time trying to understand how come all these individual people don't just fragment and disappear. Because we could look at a state like, the UK, which is highly organized, and say it's the local council, it's the civil service, it's the social care. But in fact, you take all of that away, and people are still embedded in social groups. People still have a connection to one another. So what is that social glue? And in anthropology, we kind of started looking at this a very long time ago The nugget of it is really the gift. It's the exchange. It's when we exchange something. Way back in the 1920s, Marcel Mauss wrote a very famous essay called The Gift. And he argued that when you give something, you are giving an obligation, right? When I give something to Habib, it's implied that Habib will at some point try to give it back to me. He will try to return something to me. And in that gift, we create a social link. And we're not just exchanging an object, we're exchanging a bit of ourselves. So Mauss called it a prestation totale. It's something that when I give something to somebody else, I'm giving a little bit of myself. That's not all kind. If I give something to Habib, I am imposing on him. I'm saying to him, I want a relationship with you. You're going to have to give something back to me, or we don't have this relationship. It's going to fall apart. If he wants a relationship with me, he's going to have to give it back to me. If I accept it from him, then of course it's a chain. It never ends. About 50, 60 years after that, Marshall Solins came along and identified different kinds of reciprocity. And the one that really matters for kinship and religious organizations, I would argue, is what he called generalized reciprocity. Generalized reciprocity is when the social value of the exchange is not driven by the material value of the object. In fact, the social value is much more important than the material object. So I stumbled across this by accident way back 20 odd years ago in my little village in rural Punjab where I've done field work. I was not able to get some clothes made for someone, so I just gave them the cloth by itself. And everyone got really excited because giving cloth is something that families do. Giving clothes, anyone can do, but giving cloth is something that only intimate people do. It's something that you really means you're in a different kind of relationship. And I stumbled into that by accident. But in fact, what it did was transform the nature of the relationship that I had with the people with whom I gave that cloth to. And I started getting a different kind of gift. So the objects were in fact less valuable than some of the other objects I'd given to them, but they were particular kind of objects that signaled what kind of relationship we had. Now, how does this relate to crises? How does this relate to coronavirus? Well, I'm going to ask Habib in just a few minutes to talk about what his organization and what he, as someone who kind of has inhabited and lived some of this reciprocity, what he thinks about it. But I want to give you an example. In Punjab and in the ethnography of Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we have spent, it's fair to say, a disproportionate amount of our time focusing on gift exchange. We pay a lot of attention to all the exchanges that go back and forth. And one of the things that we found, so way back in the 50s, Zekia Egler and Frederick Barth, the two first ethnographers of Pakistan, they found that this exchange networks really did define social groups, right? So the people with whom you go to the weddings, the people with whom you exchange gifts, they were your social world. They were the people that you were most closely associated with. In Zekia Egler's famous ethnography called A Punjabi Village in Pakistan, she writes quite amusingly about the extent to which these gifts are not optional. Okay, we can call it altruism. I give somebody a gift and I don't expect anything back, but in fact, I do expect something back. I expect them to be part of my social world. And if they refuse it, then what they're saying is they don't want a relationship with me. So it's quite delicate to refuse a gift. So Zekia Egler gives us a famous example. This is a lot of gift exchange between women. She gives a very famous example of one group of women turning up at another group of women's house, giving them gifts. And these Punjabi women went through and they said, okay, yeah, I like these gifts. I like these gifts. They took some of it out and they gave it back. They said, no, we don't want those gifts. You keep that, we keep this. And they kept about half of it. That's because there's another aspect of this gift gifting. It can be competitive. I might try and assert some aggressive dominance over someone else by excessive gift giving. It doesn't exist between parents and children, right? Parents and children, that's not an issue, but it could exist between brothers or between in-laws. I might turn up at my brother's house or my sister's house and give a really big gift to show my brother-in-law I'm better than he is. I'm more powerful. I'm more successful than he is. If he doesn't give back a comparable sort of gift, then he's admitting that he's not as good as me. Just for the record, my brother-in-law is every bit as good as me. I have no problem with any of my brothers-in-law, but that's the logic of excessive, aggressive gift giving. So I think what Zekia Egler's ethnography shows us is that Punjabi villagers understand the social importance of these gifts and they engage in them in strategic and useful ways. This is very, very important when we get to crises. How does it help in a crisis? Well, The example that I like to go to is by a book, it's actually from South India, a book called Why They Did Not Starve. This is by an ethnographer called Morgan McLaughlin. And in the mid-1960s in southern India, in the village that he was working in, it was a village called Yasavahali, or Hali, I don't know, Vahali, I don't know how to say it. There was a profound drought. This drought lasted for a very long time, and they got less than, I think they got 12 inches of rain in the year, which is a fraction of what they're used to. And yet no one in the village died. There was not a single death in that region. People survived. How did they survive? Well, it turns out they had an extensive network of intensive agriculture that was based on groundwater. So they were able to lift the groundwater. How did they have that? Why did they have that? These wells that they had to dig require about 60 people to dig a well. Well, 60 people is beyond what a single household can manage. So what they did, because marriage was very important to these villages, they married between villages. The village elders, the household elders, they controlled the marriages, and they basically linked marriage to digging wells. If you didn't contribute to digging wells for other people, then they wouldn't help you find a marriage partner. Well, marriage is crucial for the success of a household, which means that suddenly digging wells had to be crucial for the success of a household. So before this drought ever occurred, these people in these villages, they had a network of cooperation already in place linked around their cooperative marriage strategies. In fact, what McLaughlin tells us is they made digging fashionable. In other words, they made cooperation fashionable. They made it cool. It was a neat thing to do, to go dig wells for somebody else in another village. And this was all tied to the reciprocal exchange of goods and, in this case, people. So men would go from one village to, well, women would go from one village to another and back and forth. So the exchange of brides, the exchange of grooms, that was crucial. That was the underpinning logic for all of the cooperation that could be harnessed for much more mundane material development in the area that enabled them to survive that crisis and enabled them to survive that profound drought. I think we can all think about the 2005 earthquake. We can think about more recent crises in Pakistan. And if you know anyone in Pakistan, you will start thinking about how people were able to shift resources from one part of the country to another part of the country, not through the army, not through the state, but actually through personal connections of family. Now I'm going to stop here and I'm going to ask Habib to please take that idea and tell me a little bit about the role that first tell us about his organization and tell us how his organization has dealt with past crises, but then specifically, how are they dealing with the current coronavirus crises? So Habib, if you could first just introduce your organization for us, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lyon, and thank you everyone who has joined us here today. So my name is Habib. I'm a student at Institute for Muslim Cultures. So I have basically inherited an institution which is basically a combination of both a shrine system and a madrasa, which houses orphans as well as provides other religious services to the community. But the central part is the spiritual leadership that holds the whole institution all together. It is basically of a Qadriya lineage, was established by my great-grandfather, and it is of actually based in a village called Chohar Sharif, close to the capital, actually, an hour up north. So a couple of years ago, I inherited the leadership role from my brother after his demise. So I found myself in a position where I basically had to face a lot of challenges in terms of actually managing both the administration and the community based on their expectations. So the institution itself is basically a half Waqf institution, is basically an endowed institution, and the state takes care of half of its affairs, but the leadership remains with the family. So that means it basically collects zakat and fitranas, and fitranas are a yearly or even monthly payment that people pay to the institution in return for the religious services that the institution provides. And those religious services are mainly about running the mosques and providing all other sorts of religious, let's say, events or julus, for example, or the ceremonies that are prevalent in a Pakistani society. So this has been always a normal exchange between people, where people pay the zakat and fitranas, and also the pellets on Eid, for example, and in turn, the institution always provides the religious services to the community. But in terms of the crisis, where those things actually shift from just religious services, where people have different expectations. So I would like to basically divide those two different expectations. One are material, and the other ones are more in a spiritual sense, right? So the redistribution of zakat that always happens once in the material sense. At one hand, it happens in terms of actually free food, which is langar, always on the shrines. That is that I think most of you are familiar with, and also the housing to the orphans and the students who live there, and their lodgings, for example, and other community services like. But on the other hand, the spiritual part of it consists of sermons and the spiritual the exchange that happens between either me as a person as a central spiritual figure, or the scholars that actually meet people and listen to their problems and give them religious sermons, for example. So this is a twofold phenomena that happens. One, there's a material exchange, and the other hand, there's a spiritual exchange that's going on. Using that as a foundation, what I personally have encountered, especially previously in small-scale crises, is that people have those two different sort of expectations from you, and it is particularly a challenge to manage both things all together, where people expect, because these things basically intertwine at some point. So people expect you to be spiritually present for them, which basically you can call it a term called barakah. So the barakah is a form that they expect to have either from your ancestors or you as a present that acts through your charisma. And on the other hand, as leaders, I think, as responsible people for the institutions, we always need to do what is best in the interest of people. So we always have to manage these two things of what people are expecting, but also respecting their expectations, but in turn also doing something that is actually helpful for them. And for a lot of ordinary people, they wouldn't really understand, especially in terms of in the crisis of Corona pandemic, where I think this sense of the world coming to an end has become very profound now, and a lot of people are coming back to religion, and even people that I did not see connected to the shrine or the institution before are now coming in big numbers back to religion and spiritual practices, and they are really turning to a figurehead like me. So to manage those expectations and actually doing something pragmatically and materially, and to help them elevate their conditions, for example, right now in crisis of coronavirus, especially, I think it has become a challenge. And I think that this challenge that is posed is mainly by distance. I think that is a central notion even now, that social distancing has become I think a very prominent feature of coronavirus right now. And I think this concept of barakah relates to this social distance measures as well, in terms of virtuality of spirituality, is the term that I would like to use, is how this virtually, the barakah that people expect from you and how you manage that from a distance. And also you have to manage their material affairs and their social economic condition that you're responsible for in return. You basically manage that on a virtual. I mean, I am managing right now through a virtual environment. We've been under lockdown right now, and I've been in the UK so far. The coronavirus pandemic has started. So, but what my take on it has been that I started sort of a GoFundMe project to direct some donations and funds from some foreign nationals that to the institution itself, and try to elevate and their conditions. What I would, in anthropological or sense, what I would say is this brings a sort of an absence of charisma. So the absence is becoming a big challenge for me from the community, where I could be on the ground and pragmatically help the people, but baraka is intact. So the baraka is what people really expect you to have. Also, in addition, they want your physical presence there. But to manage those two things, to sort of combine baraka and the charisma, and sort of try to do what is good for the people themselves, while respecting their expectations, I think has become a major challenge. But this is a new form of, I would say, spirituality that is coming to light in this current coronavirus pandemic. And yes, and as Dr. Lyon was talking about the social glue, so I think this another interesting facet is this concept of spirituality that really keeps people intact and keeps them together in this sort of exchange where of spiritual and material well-being. I think it's has come to light in this, especially in this pandemic.
Thank you very much, Habib. I think you've raised a number of really important issues there, and interesting issues that are probably very familiar to anyone who's been involved with the Aga Khan Development Network and what AKU and AKDN try to do. Because in fact, it's not dissimilar to what you're describing. There's an educational side to it. There's a support side. So, you know, AKDN through AKU has the hospitals, which right now those hospitals are open and they're trying to provide not only coronavirus support, but also the other healthcare needs that people have. And that's a major part. That's not what we do in ISMC in London, but it is a very important part of what they do in East Africa and in Pakistan. And I think it dovetails very nicely with what you're talking about. I imagine, I'm not an Ismaili myself, but I imagine that Ismailis will probably understand exactly what you're talking about, that they want not just material reassurance, material support, but also that spiritual reassurance. So I think that's something that the religious side actually does, you know, sometimes well, sometimes badly. But on the kinship side, family, I don't know that people are looking to family to provide spiritual well-being. However, they are looking to family to provide a sense of place, a sense of self. Who am I? Where do I belong? And family, of course, isn't always telling you what you want to hear, but that is where you get your sense of identity, is through an exchange, through an ongoing commitment with family. So can I ask you, in this time of need, I've got friends, I watch them on Facebook and what they're doing. One of my friends is going to Gumkol Sharif almost every day. Well, not almost every day, a lot. And I see him there, no mask, no social distancing. He's there praying. He's laying his hands on the grave. He's praying to his Pir Sahib, and he's asking his Pir Sahib to save him. And I love this man dearly. I think he's an intelligent man, and I just want to throttle him. I want to say, look, man, like, this is not what you need to be doing now. Stay out of Gumkol Sharif. Stay in your village. Stay away from other people. Have you encountered this? And what do you say to your murid when they go and you know, cluster together?
Yes, actually, as I think most of us are familiar here with the condition in Pakistan, how actually the religious community sort of countered government's guidelines, and the closure of mosques was also heavily criticized. In the same way, I think as I talked about it earlier, this return to religion for a lot of people, for them it was a sense of the world coming to an end, sort of an idea that a lot of people started coming to the shrine as well. So the people back at the shrine and the institution were telling me, I mean, I'm always in contact with them, that they haven't seen this much influx of people in a very long time. And at the other hand, the government guidelines were very clear and straightforward of closing the mosque and the shrines, etc. So I had to really deal with these people in a very respectful manner. And I had to send them a couple of video messages and a lot of voice messages and a live session with them, sort of to tell them respectfully to take care of themselves and their health, and how their spirituality and is now becoming a personal thing, and the barakah is going to remain with them even if they don't come to the shrine, even if they don't come to the mosque. So I will pray, and I will try to kind of how do you say, deliver the message to the ancestors, the kind of expectations that they have from me. So it was a really big challenge to make these ordinary people understand of how their was a bit confusing for them. So it was, I think, for me as a person, I had to really take in charge both on both sides to justify the government's guidelines and also to justify the position of the institution that we are there for you, we're spiritually available, we're materially available, but for this time, you have to keep yourself at home and not come to mosques or the shrine.
I think that's a very important point. Both families and religious orders like this, the very mechanisms that we use to keep those, to reproduce those, to keep those strong, to keep those effective, may actually be counterproductive in this crisis. So when the 2005 earthquake happened, indeed, it's fine for people to go to the shrine, go to the langar, they get the blankets, they get a place to stay, they get food, they get taken care of. They go to their relatives in other parts of the country. All of those people who were caught in the areas that were kind of overwhelmed with the militants, the insurgents, they fled from those parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they went to relatives in other parts that were safer. And of course, there's no physical distance. It's the opposite. You come close together. Right now, how do we, and you've said it with the barakah, you can maintain the spiritual well-being, but we also need the material well-being to be looked after. And that, I think, is one where I don't have an answer for this, and I suspect you don't either, but I think this is one where family and kinship and religious orders, they definitely have their place. They definitely have a role to play. But actually, as you're doing, they need to be a little bit innovative. I would suggest they need to be a bit innovative in the way they respond to this crisis. On the other hand, I'm not sure how they can be. If you think about the day laborers in Karachi and Lahore, in Rawalpindi, who maybe have lost their jobs, what do? They will go to family. They will go to shrines. They will go places where they'll get fed, where they'll get taken care of. And that means the potential spread of the disease from urban areas to other areas, to rural areas. Right. And that becomes a problem. And that's where I think family and religious orders have to work very closely with the state. As I have to say, I'm very impressed that you are doing, that you are taking into mind all of the guidance given by the scientists, by the government, and I don't see how we can do anything other than that in this time of crisis. Habib, I think we probably need to open this up to questions, but would you like to add anything more before we invite people to send their questions?
I think it's just the main challenge I'm facing is to sort of maneuver between both of these expectations of people and trying to do what is in the best interest of people. So I think this is very important for, I think, people like me in the position and all the other religious leaders that are also facing the same sort of issue. So it's a very confused state of affairs at the moment, but I think a bit of clarity and a bit of sort of enthusiasm towards the welfare of the community is, I think, very central to this crisis at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, I very often get asked, is Pakistan unique? And I think, there are unique aspects to Pakistan, but I think this is probably exactly what every country is facing. So in Britain today, we have a very similar sort of issue. How do we get through this crisis while supporting our grandparents? How many grandparents in the UK are actually the primary childminders for small children? Right now, that can't happen, or at least it shouldn't be happening, right? My own parents, one of them is diabetic, and I certainly don't want him taking care of my children at the moment. I mean, my children are old enough, but I wouldn't want him to do that because that puts his life at risk. But of course, that is something that I wouldn't have hesitated to do 6 months ago. In fact, I did ask him to come look after the kids when I was away on a trip. That can't happen now. So a primary mechanism of support for us is now taken away, is now withdrawn. And I think what we're seeing here is the inadequacy of the state to genuinely provide those levels of support that family and religious organizations have provided for a very long time. possibly under the radar, possibly without acknowledgement. Certainly in the case of family in the UK, I think it's been denied and hidden, but now we see just how important that really is. Okay,
True.
so I'm going to ask my colleague who is behind the scenes. We have a bunch of colleagues here who are in the back end of this event, and they are managing questions for us. So let me pull up question 1. Okay, the focus on the gift installs a very material social discourse of understanding. It seems to me, based on my PhD research on Baraka and charisma in the actual context of Habib's Rahmania Institute in Haripur, Pakistan, fantastic, somebody knows you, that we are actually dealing with an essentially different kind of gift, namely not a social gift, but rather a divine gift, that of Baraka, which would place it in a religious, spiritual, Islamic discourse. So can you comment on the relation and differences between these two kinds of gifts and their respective discourses? I'm going to let Habib answer that in just a minute, but I think this is a very good question. It's a very on-the-point question, and it reminds me of, there's a very famous anthropological article, and the author of it, James Fair is the first part of his name. I can't remember the last part of his name. He's written about gift giving in relation to Jain ascetic monks in India. And he makes the point that these are not gifts. You cannot give if there's no opportunity to return, right? If there's no reciprocity. So you give to a korbani, a sacrifice, is not a gift. We give to God, but we have no expectation that God gives back to us, not in that kind of immediate way. So we cannot, through our gifts to God, expect or impose any obligation of a return gift. So I think this, whoever's asked this question is spot on. The gift is about exchange between people who can actually enter into that prestation totale, that exchange of selves, in a way that the divine cannot. So Habib, I invite you to comment on this.
So it's a very interesting question. So as I talked about these two different aspects, right? There's the material exchange and then the spiritual exchange that is happening. I think to just give a small example from the very day-to-day activities going on the darbar or the shrine is the food or the langar. That is sort of a nutrition provision for people, and people, a lot of people come there in exchange for their participation in the ceremony, and then to meet me and to receive some barakah in form of langar or the food. That is sort of a material provision for them. And I think these two different aspects, one which is sort of a divine gift, that is the barakah, and they expect the barakah to be in all of the other material exchanges also that they encounter while they visit the shrine on their visitations. So I think for people, and it is a combination of both things. They're this let's say holistic engagement with institution is both a form of material and spiritual engagement for them. And as Dr. Lyon have delineated it very nicely in the from a discourse point of view. So the difference in the in those two different things are basically for people. It's sort of a part of the whole same whole.
Thank you. And I've just quickly looked up the author. It's James Laidlaw, a very famous article called "A Free Gift Makes No Friends," and it's about 20 years old, but it's still useful. Okay, so question number 2: what is Habib's sect or denomination? How are the people whom he aids doing, and how is the economy in that region?
So basically the lineage is a Qadriya lineage, a Sufi spiritual order. The school of thought that the institution follows is basically a Hanafi. And so the order has now named after my great grandfather, that is Rahman. His name was Abdul Rahman. So now the order itself is called Rahmania, and the institution is now it's also called Islamia Rahmania. It's based in Haripur, a small city north of Islamabad, and the city is rather. Also, the economy in that in the region is very fragile, I would say, if that's the right word to use, and the people in this current crisis are actually very confused, very baffled by the government's response, and also lack of aid from the government, as we've got a lot of political instability in our country. And I mean, recently I'm trying to aid them. I've recently started a campaign on GoFundMe, sort of a virtual campaign that I'm starting to sort of collect funds and direct it to the institution and try to help it in a different way. I'm just recently started, I was talking about it to Dr. Lyon just yesterday, that I'm trying to start a campaign. I'm just having difficulties in actually dealing with some administrative work with my institution, just because of my lack of presence there in Pakistan. So I hope it goes well in the coming days.
Thank you. At the risk of irritating my farmer friends in Attock district, I would say that the oranges in Haripur are probably about the best I've ever had anywhere. So the economy may not be brilliant, but the agriculture is actually very good. So third question, can you speak more about what happens when social controls mechanisms are absent, e.g. for diaspora groups and those who leave their tribal or historic communities, which are also very close, especially physically? Are there benefits of this absence, or is it a negative in most cases? That's a really good question. And I think the answer would depend on who you ask. One of the things that irritates British politicians, like for those of you old enough who remember Norman Tebbit, it irritates them that British Pakistanis remain loyal to Pakistan, that they root for Pakistan in the cricket teams. They continue to get brides from Pakistan. And one of the things that has characterized British Pakistani diaspora is actually an ongoing direct connection to family back in Pakistan. So an awful lot of households in Pakistan, in Britain, they may have moved here in the 60s, but they have a first generation migrant who moved here not very long ago through marriage. So that is one way that diaspora very often maintain particularly close relationships. Those diaspora that don't maintain those relationships through marriage, I should say marriage is a principal mechanism for maintaining the ties. Yes, I think they do drift a little bit. You very often do hear diaspora complain about the demands that Pakistanis make of them when in gift exchange and in money and various resources. And you hear Pakistanis complain about diaspora that they're not very generous, they're not very hospitable, their mehman nawaz, their hospitality has somehow become too English or too Canadian or too American. By and large, I think those are the same kinds of complaints that you hear within Pakistan from rural to urban relatives, that as people move from rural areas, they move to the cities. And of course, they have a new set of social obligations. And that makes it difficult to maintain the old social obligations at the same level. But of course, the people who didn't move, they may depend on, even more increasingly depend on the kinds of remittances that come from overseas relatives. Is it a positive or a negative? There certainly is, in that kind of individualized economic world of North America, there's a real benefit to not being tied to too many people in those kinds of reciprocal obligations. If I am a self-made businessman, pulls myself up by my own bootstraps, I don't want to have to pay for my brother's daughter's wedding. I don't want to have to pay for my cousin's deadbeat son who failed out of university and needs a new job. I don't want to give it to him. That's not in my interest as an individual. But in the long term, it may actually be in my interest to maintain those social relations, because in a time like now, coronavirus collapses my economy, my business goes under. Where will I go? I know that if I turn up, I'm not even a relative, but I know that if I turn up in a village in Attock district, I will be fed, I will be clothed, I will be housed, and I don't even have to ask. I simply have to turn up. And I should add that I think I have the same kind of relationship with my relatives in North Georgia in the States. If I turn up, I will be fed, I will be clothed, and I will be housed, whether they like me or not, because I am kin. I think Habib certainly would say the same, that if the zombie apocalypse comes, Haripur is the best place for him to go, because nobody is going to refuse him support. I don't know where the best place for me in the zombie apocalypse. This is probably as close as we're ever going to get to it. But this is something that in the short term, it may be very advantageous to just dispense with all of these ties. But in the long term, these ties provide the kind of insurance that helps you to deal with precisely the crisis we're dealing with. Habib, you now have the experience of being diaspora, sort of, but also being a Pakistani. So now, how have you found it living abroad and maintaining those ties? Is it how difficult is it to balance everything and keep everyone happy?
I think it's particularly become a major challenge for me while maintaining my degree or my education here, and then maintaining the social relationships that I have to, as in my position as well. Everything is very much centered around, or it has become I think in a very recent this development where people now depend just not on their spiritual exchange of just barakah or their engagement with you, but also their material and social sort of ties that you have with them. And I think it has, I mean, internet has helped me quite well. I think this is a new surge of technology that we also have seen in the coronavirus pandemic and how it's being used now. And I think it has now even become even more necessary for us to use those means that we have to remain in touch with people. And social media especially has helped a lot. There's a lot of groups and some groups on WhatsApp, and also to maintain, I mean, people keep contacting you via those social media platforms, and I have to be sort of active in just not replying to them, but also sometimes recording some video messages and also doing some live sessions on the ceremonies that were actually happening. But it is particularly a major challenge. And I've been traveling to and fro as well last year. This year I've been busy with my master program.
Yes, he's been very busy with the master's program. Okay. Oh, here's a very scary question. How can family or religious reciprocity function in a context of complete societal shutdown? And of course, this is the stuff of Hollywood dystopian movies, right? This is what Mad Max would certainly suggest that's what happened. I think the nice thing that we've seen, certainly in London, is that we have not become cannibals. We have not become awful to one another. We've actually been quite decent to one another. And I don't know, I have heard many people talk about this has been the impetus to connect with family. So we have actually connected with our family. I've had family reunions now with my sisters. My sisters and I have not all been in the same room very often for the last 20 years. And yet we've done it multiple times now, the same Zoom room. And Habib just talked about more people coming to the shrine than ever before. Habib, I wonder if you could speculate in a context of complete societal shutdown. Let's say, you know, imagine Afghanistan. Afghanistan in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, things really did collapse. What happens then in that context? What is the role? Your institute oversees roughly 900 mosques. Would it be possible to continue that kind of coordination over those 900 mosques in the event of complete economic and political collapse of the Pakistan country?
What I would say is, I mean, religious affairs or the networks that actually function under the religious leaderships normally have their own very informal sort of functioning in the society, and it has always depended on traditional methods of mode of communication and in travel and social interactions. And I think that has been disrupted, definitely. This is why you also see a lot of criticism and a lot of counter initiatives coming from a lot of religious groups against the government and the lockdown. And I think governments particularly faced this challenge from people. So definitely there is this obstacle to, not just because most of the times the religious affairs or the functions depend on mass congregations and on people coming together in mosques and in shrines, and this whole system is disrupted. But obviously with the surge of internet, it has definitely moved, I think, a bit to the internet. The social media has sort of somehow saved people's anxieties, where if they cannot go to a congregation or listen to an imam, they can tune into YouTube and Facebook and listen to all kinds of scholars and leaders speaking. But when it comes to also their interaction with their imams or their pir sahibs, in case of my position, they really seek out your personal number, your Facebook, and the groups that are formed on your name. So they are constantly and regularly posting there and writing something and posting old pictures, actually, because not new pictures are coming up, no new ceremonies are taking place. So they keep posting like pictures from previous year, not very different from the Western countries posting vacation pictures from last year. So.
Cool. A good example of this actually is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Manuel Castells, a sociologist, wrote about the phenomenon of the resurgence of religion, that these kind of really simple ways of organizing people, simple forms of reciprocal relations, actually, those are very easy to reproduce. And family and some aspects of religion are actually, they're what we call economically efficient, right? Informationally, economically efficient. They don't require a complex set of organizations or hierarchies. If you have a relationship with your father, with your mother, with your brother, with your sister, those relationships are fairly easy to reproduce and to maintain. Other kinds of relationships that rely on the state, they take a lot more investment of resource and time and information to maintain. So another question we have, how can civil society institutions like AKU fit into the wider social institution structure? Essentially, how can civil society work with social institutions for the betterment of people, especially now in a time of crisis and physical distancing? I think it's a very good question, and it's one that we should be asking not just about AKU, but about civil society organizations much more broadly. I think looking at what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is trying to do, that's another comparable sort of organization to AKDN that is trying to nudge society in particular directions that will be better for, I think both of these organizations are trying to make lives better for the individual as well as society as a whole. But this is a real challenge, how civil society organizations can operate. We can see the backlash against Bill Gates now in public social media. People are basically coming up with really wild conspiracy theories that when a civil society organization is too prominent, then they can become the target for some really quite damaging negative conspiracy theories. Habib, it's interesting that civil society in the developing world, in the global South, people argue about where civil society is, what constitutes civil society. I think your institution, as a Waqaf institution, is part of that interface between the individual, between the household, and between the state. So in a sense, you do occupy that CSO, civil society organization, place. I think this question is one that I'm sure you've been thinking about, but how can you, in your organization, work for the betterment of people now in this time of crisis? What can you do? You've mentioned the GoFundMe organization. That's a sort of a small scale thing, but at a much wider level, yesterday you were talking about the educational implications of your madrasa.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about that?
I think the urgent need is obviously providing people the ration and food and the material support that you can provide. But in the long run and on a wider scale, I think educating people about their position in this crisis and the challenges that they face as households and individuals, both from a social and religious discourse is becoming a challenge. And I think essentially very important to make people aware of just not the crisis right now, but their position within the crisis and the position that they occupy within this sort of a crisis. I think once people become aware, it will be easier for them to sort of analyze the coming challenges and to overcome them. And I think also to play this, as you said, this mediating role between individuals or household and state, I think is very important for these civil society organizations to sort of play this mediatory role in a very neutral and positive way, and to not just educate people, but also step up to pressurize the government institutions to sort of take care of the subjects. I think that's a very important role right now that a lot of institutions are playing as mediating role between the individuals and the state as social organizations or NGOs or religious institutions. I think it is very crucial time for those institutions.
I think one of the dilemmas, of course, is that the civil society organizations, in some respects, are less accountable to the people. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does what Bill and Melinda Gates tell them to do. They set the agenda. The Clinton Foundation, they set the agenda. And the difference with the state is we elect the representatives and we direct them. We say to, well, we're supposed to say to them, we elect the people who have an agenda. So CSOs, I mean, I think CSOs have the strength of that vision and continuity and consistency, but they have the potential drawback of a lack of accountability. Okay, here we go. Question 6. Eid is coming up in Pakistan this weekend. And of course, people will want to gather and come together. This is because people are embedded in their cultures, which particularly in Pakistan are very long-standing, go back generations. So how can social institutions address this so that there is behavioral shift and an awareness to understand why this would be detrimental to their well-being? I think that is that's the $64 million question, as they say. How can we do that? Because clearly, this is crucial. If we go back to the 1918 Spanish flu, there was the first wave, and then people went out for a 4th of July parade. This is what I read on Facebook. And we had the second wave with a vengeance because people wanted to go. They were desperate to see other people, and they thought it was over. They thought it was good. Well, now I think many people are in that position. They have had enough. In London, in Britain, we've had roughly 8 weeks of this lockdown. I go out on the street now and I see that people are jumping at the chance to be out, to go get a haircut. Because still can't get a haircut, but they're desperate for interaction with other people. And Eid al-Fitr has got to be one of my favorite holidays of all time. Anyone who has been fasting, that is the most joyous, fantastic event, because suddenly all that pressure of fasting is gone. And what you do, you go and you see your friends and you share your good times with other people. So, I mean, what are you doing? How can you redirect that, Habib, to get people to, you've talked about the baraka, which can be had in absence of the peer. How can you have the commensality, the community in the absence of the close physical interaction with family and loved ones?
I think this is one thing that you really can't stop. If you can't stop that in the, as you said, in London, a lot of people are desperate to go out. And I think it's very much similar in terms of Pakistan, and especially with the occasion of Eid, where people are actually wait the whole month of Ramadan to come together. And it just goes beyond than just a social interaction. It is very much of a religious nature. The event is very special for people. I mean, this is particularly a challenge, but what my take on this is, because I was just recording a latest video in which I was thinking of adding something with the Eid and trying to make people focus on their Eid as a celebration of sort of helping people and using that amount of money that they would use to actually buy new clothes or spend all that on Eid to instead use that money to help and elevate those people in need. This is the kind of thing I thought that people could do instead of actually, but educating them and making them aware of the problem is also another problem. So I think this is a very tricky question, to be honest, but I think the government is also going to face a problem and a backlash on this issue.
Yeah, I think they are. And I think all governments, particularly when there's inconsistency in the messages coming from the leadership, I don't think Pakistan's particularly guilty of that, but there are some pretty egregious examples of leaders saying one thing and the policy of the government being something diametrically opposed.
Right.
So we have another question. We are social beings, absolutely, particularly in communities in Pakistan, India, and so on. Being with our families and communities, it gives us identity and a sense of belonging. How can we still maintain our sense of belonging without those foundational relationships? Well, first of all, I think those foundational relationships, I 100% agree. Those foundational relationships give us a very tangible, real sense of who we are. We can get part of our social selves from our workplace, from our education, but at the base, I think we are embedded in family. This is absolutely crucial. The other kinds of communities, a religious community, that's stronger for some people than it is for others. But for those for whom it's very, very strong, that is absolutely the core, right? That's the base. How can we do it? Well, I think many religious organizations, as Habib talked about, are moving online. Families are moving online. That is easier to do in Britain and Europe. Becomes a problem when you're talking about, I was just in Gilgit in March, and me and my colleagues were there with our phones, sort of holding them up, trying to get the 3G connection. There was no 3G connection to be had, or hardly a 3G connection to be had. It's much more difficult when you don't have that reliable online connection. Now, let me go to the last question. I'm afraid we're run out of time now. This is very nice. We've been thanked for the presentation on the topic. That's very good. My question is, it's being said that coronavirus has come for a long time. What is your take on the power of family and faith in helping us live with the virus rather than waiting for the time when the virus will leave us? I'm talking from the belief and emotional perspectives rather than social perspectives. I think this is a really good question. It's a difficult question, but it's a good question. I don't think we will get through this without family, to be honest. I really think that family is crucial for that emotional well-being. We have in Aga Khan University a counseling service, and we encourage all of our students and our staff and our colleagues to make use of this counseling service. But counseling service, they'll help you to talk through problems, and I'm not knocking that. That's a crucial thing. It's a very, very important tool. But what I see among my students and among my friends is that those who are with family, those who are able to have regular contact with family, either online or in person, they are doing better than those who are on their own. Now, of course, this is not a very big sample and not been very systematic about it, but I genuinely believe that family is going to be essential for this. Habib, could you speak to the religious element of it?
Yes, I would talk about the faith element. That's what I was just thinking when I read the question. I think this pandemic or this this new way of doing things has actually brought a shift in religious practices as well. And I think we would, in the future, definitely see more of a shift towards contemplative practices rather than going into mass congregations and following more of an institutional version of religion. People will now sort of reflect on their own and engage with the discourse of religion that I've seen some people already doing when they've got time with themselves. Considering the family element that Dr. Lyon talked about, but on the other hand, now the religion is going to be very much personal in the future. And I think that is one way of getting through it, through those contemplative practices and those meditational practices that are very essence to religion and faith. They will just become more pronounced and more common among people. But obviously it needs sort of a awareness and education on that. But this is what my take on that is.
Thank you. Turns out we squeezed in time for one more question. Is there a hierarchy of identity roles, religious, family, social, formal, or informal roles for individuals that determines how social institutions are created? Does this change or shift in crisis situations like COVID-19? Yes, I think that's a good question. It's an empirical question that we need to study. So if I were to just tell you, here's the hierarchy, almost certainly I'd be wrong, right? So I've spent the last 20 odd years studying social formation, social organization, social identity in a Punjabi village in Pakistan, in northern Punjab. And I'm still trying to figure out what the hierarchy is. I'm still trying to figure out what comes first, what's more important. And I think this is something that probably shifts through time, that when you're very little, religious identities probably are very, very superficial and very loose, but your family identity is crucial. As you get older, I'm sure that one of the things you've all seen, like I've seen, many of my friends, they are not necessarily strict Muslims when they're young men, but they all, when they hit sort of 45, 50, they start growing beards and they start praying 5 times and they give up the bad habits and they become very good Muslims, right? In one sense, very good. I think they've always been very good Muslims, but they become a different kind of Muslim. The spirituality becomes more important to them as they face their own mortality and as they take stock of who they are in life. But family also becomes extremely important to them. They pay attention to these things. So I think these things really do constantly throughout a life get adjusted. It's not just that there's one that's important and the other one is second and most important. It's that at different times in life, in different contexts, they may get activated in different ways. Habib, we have only a minute, but I'd like to give you the last word, particularly on this topic. Where do you see these changes happening as a result of COVID-19? Do you see changes happening to the social identities and the sense of self?
Yes, as I just would reflect on the last statement that I made, I think a lot of form of worship and religious engagement, not just with their leaders, but also other scholars, for example, and religion in general. I think these attitudes, the behavior, and the engagement would definitely change, if not from a personal note, but it's going to be somehow social. The society will see this sort of a change, and I think we all need to sort of adjust to that in the long run. But hope is there, and I think faith and family is what definitely will make us get us through this crisis.
Thank you very much. Habib, it remains for me to thank you, Sahibzada Habibur Rahman. It's been a great privilege and a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I'd also like to thank Abdul Haq Wahedna, who is the head of our alumni relations, and Fatima Danani, who has pulled all this together out of nothing. So our alumni team, 2 thumbs up to you. Thank you very much. And I hand over to whoever it is that finalizes these. We are very grateful for your time, and I look forward to meeting many of you in person. Okay, so they say nobody else is coming on here. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Stay safe. And when it comes time, enjoy your Eid without going to hug all of the people you have not been hugging already in your household. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you all. Thank you, the team.